Hello, and welcome to our Chapter 11 lecture on managing strategic alliances. I love this chapter because we're going to talk about some challenges, but also the beauty of working together across organizations. So my first question is, will you form an alliance with me? When we think about forming alliances, we have to think really concretely about who we're getting into business with, what they value, what we value, and what it feels like to have those dependencies, relying on someone else. Now, the purpose of today's lecture is to understand the value of these partnerships and interactions. They are extraordinarily valuable if done right. And so the way your book puts this is conceptualization of organizational environments suggests a need to focus more attention on how specific organizations interact with one another. Basically, until we consider our environment and the organizations and individuals outside of us, we cannot fully understand our own behavior in the interactions. And so we really need to make sure that we're positioning ourselves appropriately in the environment and that we don't get so inwardly focused, right? We're not just managing our staff and day to day, and then we miss out on this big new policy or expectation from our community because we weren't doing what we call environmental scanning, where we're aware of what's going on around us. Now, this chapter will be talking about strategic alliances, which are defined as formal arrangements between two or more organizations for the purposes of ongoing cooperation and the mutual sharing of both any risks or any gains. So we share in the good and the bad because we're working together. Now, quite often we'll think about things like mergers and acquisitions, right? The idea of acquiring someone or merging organizations, but it's not always that complete. Sometimes you're just in a partnership working together towards a goal. Quite often there's a contract or an agreement, but it depends on the situation. And so we're going to refer to these as alliances, strategic alliances, or cooperative linkages. And really our goal is not to fixate on whether or not we fail or succeed. It's not black and white. It's about mutual collaboration. And so something good might come from that collaboration, but it may not meet your goals necessarily. And so we have to think about kind of a diverse set of measures, lots of different things that we look at when we decide if we're going to collaborate with somebody, how we'll measure the success of that, and how we'll assess the risk. Because there is a lot of risk when you work with other folks, but there's also so many groups you can partner with as a health services organization, depending on what area you're working in. Now, healthcare alliances are on the rise. This is an old graphic because it's a special graphic. This is something from the New York Times from 2012 with data through 2012. And it's looking at this wave of hospital mergers that happened between 2005 and 2012. With the uptick of the Affordable Care Act, we've seen even more of that, but this huge boom happened, and now we're seeing additional, this consolidation. The article that's linked here refers to it as a surge in deal making, but this is an article from California Healthline, so take a look at that too. But you can see there are so many, both for-profit and non-profit hospital systems acquiring other hospitals. And that's what this is a graphic of. And you'll notice it's going up almost straight year over year, right? There's a little dip in 2009, but a lot of acquisitions, a lot of consolidation where a health system will buy one or two hospitals at a time. Now, we have to think about all of the different players in health services administration. We've got suppliers and supplies, pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies. We've got providers, right? So we've got to think about physicians and hospitals and medical groups. We've got buyers, we've got patients and health plans. There's a lot of different parties here, so we can collaborate in a lot of different ways. Maybe your hospital forms a strategic alliance with a health plan, right? Which it's almost an exclusive contract where you see almost all of their patients in the area. Or maybe your hospital forms a strategic alliance with a community organization in order to grow both of your impact. And so there's a lot of different types of alliances. We've got some that involve some very strict ownership and control. A good example of tight ownership that occurs when two companies come together and they share ownership of something is a joint venture. And so I've linked in an example here from an institution I used to work with, Hoag Orthopedic Institute. And this is an organization that is 51% funded and owned by Hoag Memorial Hospital and Hoag Health now, and 49% owned by the physician partners, the medical group. And so they came together with a shared pool of money and decided to form the Hoag Orthopedic Institute and Hoag Hospital Irvine, where all these orthopedic procedures were performed. Now, it's important to realize this is not the only example, but this is an example of two organizations coming together and starting something new together. And that's what we call a joint venture. I almost think about it as parents having a child, right? You need two parents to have a child in most cases, right? So in this case, we have two organizations that come together, share funds and resources to create this Orthopedic Institute. Now, when we think about types of and forms of alliances, we have some with very tight control, some with less. Some of them are large alliances, maybe the State Alliance for Health, right? A group. Some of them are very small. It's two organizations coming together. Or maybe it's even just two departments, one department from one organization, one department from another organization collaborating. Now, governance can be very complex because we all have different goals. So these are two prominent types of alliances, two types of goals that alliances might have. Some alliances are pooling versus trading alliances, and other alliances focus very strongly on cost and revenue. So let's talk about these categories. So with pooling versus trading alliances, one group is a pooling alliance, which is where we bring together all of our resources, we decide to work together, and we have this big pool of financial, fiscal, human resources to work with. A trading alliance is where we want something from one another, so we're sharing, right? You give a little of this that I don't have, I give a little of this, versus pooling similar resources, we're trading. So that's an example of a common alliance. Sometimes we are trying to grow our business, revenue enhancement. Other times we form an alliance in order to cut our costs, in order to get a better deal on something. And there are other goals for alliances too. Sometimes it's about quality and innovation and learning. Other times it's about enhancing power and reducing uncertainty, making sure that everyone in our local county is working together towards an effort. So maybe we have 4 or 5 organizations come together to do that. Now, there may be specific rationales. CEOs, senior leadership team members who know that their influence is going to grow if an alliance is formed. And so there's that self-interest component of leaders where it's like, oh, if I can take over this business and this business, that makes us more, that helps us grow and it makes me more important. But does it help the community? And so we have to think about what's good for leaders versus what's good for the organization is not always the same. And oftentimes, physicians and hospitals come together to try to manage risk, to get on the same page in forming alliances. Now, forming an alliance is a difficult process. I mean, it can be. In some cases, it's quick and easy if all the stars align. But in most cases, we have to have an idea, an introduction, this emergence that happens. Sometimes it's because the environment poses a threat and we need to come together to address it, right? But we're starting to work together. Then we move into a transition mode where we're really motivated to work together. We start consolidating resources. Maybe we even, in an acquisition situation, maybe even we change our name and we're the same organization. We work together really well, maybe for a while, we mature, and then something about it doesn't quite work. And I've got a couple examples that have happened in my career. I worked with 2 large health systems that came together in California, and I think it was about 10 years in when they realized, this isn't quite working. And they actually decided to break apart and withdraw from the alliance, that critical crossroads. That's not always what happens, but it can. Now, when we think about that emergence phase, and we have a great example in Western North Carolina because we have UNC Health Appalachian, which used to be just Watauga Medical Center, right? It used to just be Appalachian Regional Health System, right? It used to just be a local set of facilities. but they joined with UNC in order to have access to all the UNC resources. Now, they say it's not an acquisition. They didn't just acquire the hospitals, UNC Health, but it is a management agreement where UNC Health it's not owns and operates, but they operate and provide leadership for UNC Health Appalachia. So when this started, the folks at the hospital down the street, Watauga Regional Medical Center, the folks there put together an online press release. I remember this because it was, I think, fall 2021, and said, we could really use some help. We are interested in working with a larger health system. We want more technology resources and a better EHR. We are open to collaborating and having some resources given to us, and then we'll share the revenue. So that effort was to find partners. They were aware of environmental threats, how hard it is to work and operate individually. And so they started to do that and vetted potential partners. And then they ended up working with UNC, University of North Carolina Health System. Now, they've been going through, over the last few years, this transition phase where they're figuring out, is this joint ownership? Who's in charge? How does it affect contracts? Do we have a formal management agreement? They're working through that process to get to maturity, where they work really well together. The alliance starts to align with the objectives of the organization. They're achieving their goals. They're working together. They have someone managing the relationship between both parties. And then eventually they may hit this critical crossroads stage where you have to evaluate, is this working? Is the glue holding the alliance together still there? And sometimes it's just isolated people, right, that work together well. And sometimes if that goes away, the glue goes away too. But that critical crossroads stage can happen. And so it's really important as you think about forming an alliance that we have kind of a framework or perspective for analyzing alliance problems. We know that organizations often disagree on what problems are. And so there's disagreements that often can lead to false diagnoses and treatment of alliance symptoms. So we're not quite getting along or communicating well. Maybe you're taking more financial resources than I am, and I don't think it's fair. Our organizations, as we diagnose and treat our issues as organizations, there can be some disagreements. What is the real problem? What is your management team doing versus mine? And so sometimes that leads to incorrect interventions where we're not really solving the problem between us because nobody wants to call it out. Nobody wants to be direct because it's uncomfortable to say, hey, we formed this alliance and started this outpatient surgery center and you aren't contributing financially or you're not staffing the way we agreed. Whatever it might be, there can be those challenges. So we need a framework. And the framework I'm using on this slide, if you're listening, is we're almost treating it like it's a sickness. We have a problem that we have to diagnose. We have to diagnose it effectively and implement an effective solution. We can't just act like it's okay. Now, so the first thing we need to do if an alliance isn't working is we have to locate the problem. Is it with the structure? Who reports to who and holding people accountable? Is it just the outright behavior? Is it that we're not agreeing on our strategy and direction? Or maybe the environment isn't supporting what we thought it would with this alliance? Now, one of the things that's really, really challenging here is that when we want to make a change and we want to first diagnose and locate the problem, we need someone responsible for gathering that information, reporting back that is a fairly neutral third party. And so there's an example here about that, and that is difficult sometimes. It's also difficult to separate the root cause from the symptom. So we've got friction. Is it self-interest and cheating? Is it misunderstanding? Is it a lack of alignment of our organizational cultures and trust? And did you do something that I don't agree with because you were too nervous to tell me the truth about your financial situation, right? So sometimes problems snowball. And so it's hard to tell what's the cause versus the symptom. And so sometimes the way we assess it is differently. Sometimes it's asymmetric or biased because I'm assessing it from my viewpoint, right? And this can be difficult. We also want any temporary alliance arrangements to have a long-term plan. So we know where we're headed and why. And we also want to make sure that we're not overly optimistic. We don't set too big of goals and set ourselves up for failure. One of the things that I've seen that has been a major contributor to strategic alliance failure is weak infrastructure. Assuming that everybody will just get along and we'll communicate and it's fine and we're good people. No, someone needs to be assigned to manage that relationship. There needs to be focused management team meetings with everybody present on both sides. There needs to be a structure that supports the effective communication. Now, we also want to make sure that when we start out, we are selecting appropriate partners to begin with, right? My mom used to always joke about marriage. She would say, choose wisely, treat kindly. Because when you select your partner in a strategic alliance, you have to do your due diligence. You have to make sure you are trained and have everybody trained around expectations and education. You make sure that you started out at the right place. Once you're there, you're making sure that you're sharing your management decisions. You have some sort of participatory leadership, participation in your management team. You're facilitating negotiation. You're making it clear, I'm giving this and we're swapping it for this. We're both benefiting, right? Especially if it's a trading alliance or if it's a pooling alliance, we're both adding the same amount or an acceptable amount to the work together that we're doing. We want to make sure that there's no coercion. Everyone is on the same page and acting appropriately. We're all sharing knowledge, right? You want to know who you're working with. And so sometimes we can have a really cooperative partner. Sometimes they're a little cooperative and a little difficult and they're not quite doing what they need to do. Sometimes you have someone indifferent. They're just not engaged. And I say someone, but I mean an organization that you're collaborating with that just isn't responding and engaging. Sometimes you get into a strategic alliance with somebody and then you realize they're really your competitor and they're accessing your information, or maybe they're vengeful because they've been offended. And I talk about this like it's a person, but it's this set of behavior in an organization where it's like, oh, that shouldn't have happened, right? If we're working collaboratively, right, you shouldn't be taking more patients, right? And at the bottom, I've added this if you notice, because these other categories are from the textbook. I added at the bottom, are they cooperative? Are they quasi-cooperative? Are they indifferent? Are they competitive or vengeful? Or maybe they're not competitive or vengeful. They're just nervous, insecure, concerned. And sometimes that manifests in the same way. Someone who's nervous or insecure, especially imagine if you're a larger health system and you're working with a smaller health system and their CEO and management team, they may do things where you feel like, what are you doing? Why are you making this harder than it needs to be? Are you being vengeful? No. They're nervous, they're insecure, they're concerned. They're trying to stand up for themselves maybe. So we've got to leave some room for grace and understanding of those different personality types. We also want to pay careful attention for cues of how things are going. Don't just assume it's fine. Have audit processes in place where you can audit the financials. You know what's happening. You're following up and measuring data, right? Make sure that you're exploring scenarios and agreeing on really how things will be ran. And you're being vigilant, watching your partner organization's orientation. Are they changing the way they operate? And make sure that your contract or whatever agreement you have in place has exit provisions in case you hit that critical crossroads and you need to uncouple your organizations. Now, again, there's so many types of strategic alliances. Some of them, it's almost impossible to uncouple, but for many, it is possible. We'll talk about the types in just a minute. We want to make sure that we're also driving performance. So when we think about success and what drives success, at each stage, it's different, right? At the beginning, we want partners who are compatible, have similar cultures and expectations. Once we really start working together, we need not just nice words, we need action. We need to make sure that we're acting in effective and efficient ways. They need to do what they said they would do. They don't just need to be like us and friendly, they need to be effective. And then under maturity, we need to make sure that we're working well together, back to the effectiveness piece, but that we're developing long-term trust. It's a repeatable performance. Now, here's a quick slide, and this is the overview of a few types of strategic alliances, going from one extreme to the other. And so we have very loose co-marketing. Maybe we're working together, designing a marketing campaign to get folks vaccinated, but we're not really doing anything else. Co-marketing. Maybe we're working on development of a product together, R&D. Maybe we have a strategic relationship with suppliers where we work together, but they're our supplier. Maybe we're licensing or franchising, so you can use parts of my name. Maybe we have these equity-based alliances, like a strategic investment or a joint venture where we're investing in one another in a new product. Or we are fully acquiring, mergers and acquisitions. We're coming together as one organization, or an organization is acquiring the other one. So these are all ideas, concepts, but when they actually get implemented, sometimes it is a little more nuanced. So you may think it's going to be an acquisition where this company is buying the smaller company, but instead it ends up being a partnership, or vice versa. It can be different. All right, well, I hope that this was helpful for you to see and walk through this briefly. Strategic alliances are a beautiful thing, but again, we have to do our due diligence and vet our partners and be aware of that process of coming together and the pitfalls. All right, thank you and have a wonderful week.